Now I can hear myself.
I'm going to call you Dr. Allen one time before I call you Heidi.
Okay, I thought we called a rock star.
Okay,
I've heard
rock star Heidi Allen, Columbia University Social Work. Do you want to give a little bit of an intro of yourself? Because I think you were a little hesitant to get on stage today because you're not a clinical researcher, so.
Right, this is a really quick way to show I'm not a clinical researcher is to get on a stage. My name is Heidi Allen, and I'm the Associate Dean for Research and an Associate Professor at Columbia University in the School of Social Work. And I am not a psychedelic researcher. I am a health services researcher. I study access to healthcare in the United States, particularly for underserved populations. I study Medicaid, the ACA, marketplace, coverage, and the way that those things play out in people's ability to get timely, high quality, effective care. So hello? Are we still there? I'm the ghost of Christmas future. I am where psychedelics research, a new branch of psychedelic research that will happen once these molecules come to market. So that's why David invited me, is to kind of get us excited and hyped for the future, but also to talk about what needs to be put in place to make that future a reality.
Great. Thank you, Heidi. David ESSELMAN, Chief Strategy Officer for Brain Futures. Brain Futures is a nonprofit subsidiary of the Mental Health Association of Maryland. Mental Health Association of Maryland has been around for 110 years, roughly. So it's been thinking about these issues for quite some time. And Brain Futures specifically is about 7 years old to think about what is the research really saying? How do we identify innovation in brain science generally? And then what's it going to take for us to actually put it in place in the market? And so one thing that's been really helpful, and why I appreciate the Horizon staff for bringing us on stage, is we've had an opportunity the last couple of years to look at not just the research, but think about how we can actually make this accessible to folks. And in January of this year, we released a paper that I'll talk about in a little bit that kind of laid out the clinical research to date. But we're really excited to take this community, as we see it grow every single year, and translate what is in the research, drive more innovation in the space, understand a lot more from the traditional and wisdom communities, because I think there's still so much for us to also research from them, and then understand how we can actually make this accessible in a safe way and an effective way. So that's the background on us.
So David is going to start us out by kind of doing a background of how we got to where we are. And how we got to where we are. Where we are is we have these couple of molecules coming to market very plausibly, and we have everything that's happening in Oregon. So it's a very exciting time to stop and think about where we've been. So take it away.
Oh, great, thank you. So we all know that there's been a lot of research that's happened on psychedelics across compounds. There's a fairly recent explosion that has happened as well. And the truth of the matter is, this has started quite some time ago. And ironically, from Big Pharma, primarily around the 1940s, we saw this start to happen. And the one thing that was really great to see as we've come out of this last 20 years, which we'll talk a little bit about Dr. Griffith's work at Johns Hopkins in a minute, we've started to see a lot more focus on what's possible. And there's really been two tracks. There's been the FDA clinical trials track, which has been largely led by a small group of folks, more recently gotten much more expansive, as well as this great social experiment that we're about to have in Oregon with the passage of Measure 109 2 years ago. And that is essentially an opportunity for psilocybin-assisted therapy within a regulated but fairly flexible experience voted on in a democratic way via referendum in Oregon. So we're going to watch this play out in two different theaters, both of which have great promise, but also some potential peril, and I think we just need to be mindful of those two things. I did want to give a little bit of research, because I think some people in this room I know are actually, in my mind, icons of this field and have really been through this for quite some time. But I just want to set the context for research as it is. It's mostly been clinical, but there's also been a lot of papers. Since the 1950s, there's been 36,000 papers published, not all peer-reviewed, but published about what psychedelics can do. This is across a variety of compounds, many of which we don't talk about today. And there has been a lot of discussion. There was very robust discussion, particularly from our neighbors in the north in Canada, several decades ago, that I think we frankly didn't listen enough to. but also here in the US that was really robust. And the Mental Health Association of Maryland is sort of a strange nonprofit on the surface about why are they involved in psychedelic-assisted therapy now, and particularly brain futures. And the reality is, when 1971 happened, and there was robust research happening across several countries at that point, we had the Controlled Substances Act. This largely shut down overnight. There was one major exception, which is the LSD trials at the Spring Grove Center in Maryland, and that lasted a whole nother 5 years. I'm fortunate in that a couple of people still affiliated with our organization were there back then. We're fortunate to have Bill Richards with us still today, driving a lot of this work, and fortunately bringing his son into it now, who's been a tremendous researcher. And it's been really great to see. Between 1971 and roughly 2000, there was a few relatively small communities trying to hold this flame. The underground obviously surfaced, went underground, I don't know how that works, held a lot of this wisdom. Frankly, it was tied to a number of research institutions that are not coincidentally the ones that are starting to resurface these past several years. And there was a really incredible discussions to be had about what was the most priority research to have happen because of limited resources, how does it connect to the history, and that's all really critical. And I just want to give a couple of particular shout outs to Charlie Grobe at UCLA, the Hefter Research Institute, and Rick Doblin. Because obviously in the 1980s, he decided that he was going to go on this tremendous voyage with his life that we frankly are all a big part of today. So I just think it's really important to recognize those organizations and also some more of the more recent ones. The Chacruna Institute, if you have not had a chance to visit the booth outside, is really holding down a very important narrative about what indigenous communities bring to this. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in the research ahead for us to combine those two and definitely want to encourage people to look at that. And then just from a, I talked about Hefter, I talked a little bit about MAPS, but I also want to give a shout out to the USONA Institute because they also, from a nonprofit perspective, have been driving a lot of this work. And it's important to say that where we are today would not have been possible there. The last thing I would say is 2000, Roland Griffiths decided to make a slight career change, still within Hopkins, and really reopen the door for this research area. And in that time, with Hopkins, Charlie Grobe at UCLA, Tony Bassis's work here at NYU, we've started to see a fairly good trickle of new research. COVID hit us a little bit, and now we're starting to see an explosion. And it's really incredible to see the University of Wisconsin come back in a major way. I think the cocaine use disorder at the University of Alabama, Birmingham is really interesting to look at. We're seeing a lot of new institutions step into this. Baylor University with Lynette Averill, Dr. Averill, which is really impressive. University of Texas. We're seeing bipartisan legislation because of the research agenda we've had. So this history is, it's long and fraught. I only gave you 70 years of it. We know there's thousands of years prior to that, and I really encourage everyone to stick around for Sunday to hear that component because that's really where this research began, and I cannot do it justice. So thank you on that. I guess the next question is probably mostly for me as well is, what are we learning recently? We've seen a few key studies that have been really, really important. This year, of course, the alcohol use disorder study for heavy drinkers here at NYU. You'll hear about later today. Definitely important for us to think about what that means, for a number of potential future indications as well. And I think that that's, excellent to see. And most people talk about, and this was highlighted in our first paper, MAPS's phase 3 study. Participants went in, participants came out, 67% of them no longer qualified for PTSD. That's incredible. You look at psilocybin, that's obviously MDMA, assisted therapy, which we'll talk about too. You look at psilocybin, you're seeing with major depressive disorder, a major landmark study by Alan Davis at Ohio State, 71% reduction in major symptoms. We see ketamine studies with 60% major reduction. Those are sort of the high points. You're going to hear interesting stories this afternoon of a little bit on MAPS, a little bit on NYU, a little in a couple of other areas as well. But I just really want to encourage you to understand that these are all data points in what is actually a scatter plot of a very promising set of work. But underneath all of these, as Dr. Julie Holland just mentioned as well, there are some challenges that we have to think about too, and just understand that in the research there's some noisiness that we'll get into. So I think it's, I think that's pretty much the topical levels, but you had a question for me that I was not quite ready for a couple days ago, so I did a little research and thought about it, so.
Yeah, so my question is I've heard people talking about the hype, what about the hype? And I'm curious if there's been anything to counter that. Like, have there been findings in the last couple of years that people, particularly within the psychedelic community, have found disappointing?
Yeah, so I think, if you're an investor in this space the last few years, you found 2022 very disappointing. So that's been interesting to see because there's also a lot of investors that are tied in and driving, frankly, a lot of the research. So I just think that that's a little bit of a market dampening effect that's going to be, I think, a little bit disappointing on a sort of market access perspective. But I also think you have to go back to, a couple of studies these past few years. There's a really important study that Dr. Robert Carhart-Harris did when he was at Imperial College, now at UCSF, around comparing an SSRI to a psychedelic. And the results were, somewhat better, but not outstandingly better. And so what does that really mean for us as a field? Because if you participated in the psychedelics of business yesterday, you heard these economic arguments about the fact that so much of what this healing does happens up front. And right now we have a healthcare system in America where they sell you a pill cheaply for several years. And the economics actually get really challenging for us to think about something that is marginally better. So I think we really have to have a little bit of a conversation with ourselves about what is good enough, and then also how do the economics play into this? Because I think we can find a number of things that work better than SSRIs, but we have to recognize the fact that it is the treatment as usual right now. It is affordable. There's a very strong set of institutions behind it. And I think the slam dunk data points that we often talk about is not a strong enough case for the system as a whole. So I think that that's one thing I would say. I think there's been a lot of promise around microdosing too, and a lot of expectations, and anecdotally, a lot of folks say this is an answer for me. I think the data's been really questionable. And do you really understand whether or not that's, is that really outsized? We talked a little bit, you hear Dr. Holland talk about expectancy effects. It's really challenging to kind of parse that out, particularly at a micro level. So I think that's it. And then I just think about hype generally, 20 years ago when Roland Griffiths made this transition, he's done a tremendous amount of work. I think we all have to take a pause and listen when Dr. Yaden and Dr. Potash and Dr. Griffiths put an article out a couple months ago and say, this hype could be dangerous. Because the reality is, we have a lot of good anecdotal information. We can all come up with pitch decks that talk about why that's important. But the challenge is we're not going to be able to really convince regulators, payers, providers, the community at large who's still largely skeptical, particularly communities of color that are very concerned about what this looks like in a meaningful way without us getting much more information, much more data, frankly, much more real-world data. So we'll see where that goes. So I think a little bit, in the coming years, the other thing I would say is we've had so much focus on MAPS getting through with MDMA-assisted therapy. We've had so much focus on Compass and Usona with psilocybin, and that's great. Our first paper covered 7 compounds, including ketamine. I know some people weren't happy about that, but we think it's important. The reality is, if you, again, saw yesterday, there are thousands of other compounds that we've not really fully explored yet. And so I think we're really in an incredible point right now to see novel therapies come out, a lot of new compounds that we've never actually talked about before. I think we're going to start to see whether it's schizophrenia or what doctors Pittenger and Kalmendi are doing at Yale around OCD. We're going to see a lot more interesting indications, a lot more interesting compounds, and hopefully a lot more researchers, because we were pretty bi-coastal. We're starting to see a lot of other institutions come in now. It's going to be a really exciting ride, I think, the next several years in psychedelic research. So, Heidi, let's talk about real-world evidence. Sorry for this microphone. Because I think clinical trials are amazing. They tend to be very small. They tend to be incredibly controlled. Can we talk about real-world evidence and why?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a whole field, an interdisciplinary field of research that is on what happens once something goes past clinical trials and is actually in the market. And that's the discipline that I'm part of, which is called health services research. And it's interesting because you're taking it out of a laboratory, which is very controlled. The patients that enroll in a clinical trial are by necessity homogeneous because you want to take out any other characteristics that could influence the outcomes. And so the diversity of who walks into a clinic isn't represented. So I think the most obvious example is that in clinical trials, we tend to look for people that have one condition, not many conditions, because of the interaction between chronic physical health conditions or multiple mental health issues. But that's not what you see in the real world. The real world is messy. The real world, people don't necessarily have people in their life that can be their support system when they're done with a therapeutic session, which is something I know that we like to have in the clinical trials. But this whole branch of research is not yet part of the scene. So, I went to my first and actually only prior psychedelic conference 3 years ago and gave a talk that was about what happens when these kind of molecules come into a healthcare system like the one we have in America, and what are some concerns that we should have. And for me, it was a really typical health policy, health services research talk, and I was surprised by how the conversation hadn't gotten there yet. So the conversation hadn't gotten to the place of who's going to walk in through the door, when the rules of a clinical trial are off, how are people actually going to deliver care, to whom, who will want the care, who will not want the care, how much will it cost in real life, who will pay for it, what will the quality be, and what will the outcomes be. And it's a really exciting new frontier for psychedelic research to be bringing in the scholars who study that. There will be some very significant challenges, though, and that will be largely related to data. And so this is why I feel like we need to start having these conversations now. How will we know who's getting care? How will we know for what they're coming in to get care for? I think on-label and off-label use is interesting because this MDMA may be FDA approved for PTSD, but that doesn't mean that's the only thing it will be prescribed for. So there's a real opportunity to put in place data infrastructure to allow us to have big N studies, and by N I mean sample size, but to really start aggregating across clinic sites, across populations, across conditions, across different types of delivery systems. I think we will see people who do this kind of work in their office without a second person there. I think that that's very likely. We will see clinics that open that serve that just do psychedelic therapy, much like we see with the ketamine clinics now. And that will be one very prominent model of care, but there'll be another really prominent model of care, and that will be therapists who go and get trained and do this as part of their clinical practice. That's very different. It's very different to come in and meet somebody for the very first time, have 3 preparatory sessions, do 3 medicine sessions, do integration, and then go back to your real therapist. That's very different than doing this work with your real therapist. And I actually couldn't tell you which would be better from now. I mean, I can see pros and cons of both. But the great news is this is all stuff we can study and learn from, and then we can, become more efficient in the work that we do and more effective in the work that we can do. And so I think that that's really exciting. One thing that I want to say about health services research to kind of set the stage is that health service researchers study how people get access to healthcare, how much healthcare costs, and what happens to patients as a result of this care. The main goals of health services research are to identify the most efficacious and equitable ways of delivering and financing high-quality care while reducing harm and improving safety. There will be thousands of studies that will come from this perspective. And those of you who are participating in the building out of the delivery system right now for future psychedelic use, particularly those who are building it out through ketamine, I'd like you to take a step back and think, how will the world know what's happening in this clinic? what data are we collecting and where are we going to share it so that we know both that what we're doing is as efficacious as what other clinics are doing, but so that we can be part of building this real-world evidence base that will allow this field to grow, to improve. I anticipate when these molecules are rescheduled, that the NIH will be funding this kind of research, and that many universities will build a research agenda around trying to understand these access issues and quality issues and how we can innovate in the way that we're doing things. Other frontiers that I see coming are synergies with existing evidence-based treatment approaches. I heard some conversation about that last night at a Cohen Foundation event of using a therapy, an evidence-based therapy modality with MDMA in couples. That's also a new frontier. I think another frontier will be comparing compounds. So, at some point you don't need to have a placebo. You compare outcomes from people that have MDMA and psilocybin, or new compounds that come down. I think there will be a lot of really creative, rigorous models to allow us to try to get at causal impacts. Some examples of that are research that uses usual care as a control, research that, how many of you saw the colonoscopy study that came out recently? It's very controversial, actually, but they used, you can't randomize people to not having effective treatment. Like, that's one of the ethics of research, is if you know something is really efficacious and important, you can't say to people, we're not going to give it to you. That's an ethical violation, but you can do special outreach to people who would not necessarily have been likely to do it before, and you can use that extra randomization to bring in people and compare them to a group that had no extra outreach. And that's a way of, it's called the instrumental variable approach. That's a way of getting at causal inference in these kind of real world settings.
Heidi, can I ask you a question on that? So
Yeah.
we talked about blinding, the impossibility of blinding with psychedelics and expectancy effects. Is that one way that researchers can think about counteracting that piece?
Yeah, I mean, so again, this is where my not being a clinical researcher comes into play. Like, God bless you all for trying to come up with a placebo for psilocybin and MDMA. People are like, okay, if you take a teaspoon of hot pepper and plunge the room into darkness, it might almost resemble a psilocybin drink. I mean, that's really tough, right? That's really tough.
You feel flushed after a Serrano. It's true.
Yeah, and I think that, especially, the expectancy issues, from a research perspective, I find it so intriguing because in a way, early on, I think in the research it could have benefited, basically made the treatments look more effective than they are because people were hopeful, and hope is a really powerful drug. But now I think it's like the Hamilton effect, right? Where, Hamilton, everyone loved Hamilton, and it was like so moving. And then by the time, most of America saw it, it'd been so hyped that they were disappointed, right? Like, I think that is very, people are expecting to come in and have a profound, life-changing, alternate, I'm healed, amazing experience. And when it doesn't live up to that, they could feel really down about it. So I think that I think that that's when we get out of the clinical trials, I think we'll be moving more into research where we compare usual care to new treatments, and where we start to use, it's not uncommon at all in healthcare delivery to have research where you have no placebo group. Like that, most of it is in that context. So there's a lot of methodologies that will come into play for that.
So we have a few minutes left, and I have two topics I want to hit on with you really quickly because they're structurally really important.
Okay.
Number one is about representation in trials and what can we do about it. And so I'll tee that up and give you about 90 seconds on it.
90 seconds. Okay. First of all, I think if you want to have diverse clinical trials, you need a diverse scientific research pool. Thank you. And that means that we need to be investing in people in the pipeline. We need to be building researchers. We need to be working with historically Black colleges and universities. And we need to, fund their research. We need to fund their PhD pathways. We need to give them postdocs. We need to give them the same career opportunities so that they can be the scientists that are recruiting for the studies. And I think that will be very, very important. And then also I think that moving to real world conditions will really help, because we will be able, some of these studies are happening in places that aren't as diverse, like Wisconsin. But also, I think that the exclusion criteria of not having comorbidities really excludes a lot of people.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that. And, in the last topic, because I think real world is really expensive or really important, and just if you have questions, this is a good time to get it, because we're going to go to Q&A in just a couple, is Oregon. And I think we hear, this is going to change the game, this is going to be a challenge, we're really concerned about it, but you actually have a unique history with Oregon I'd love you to touch upon and give your perspective about what that state could do with this tremendous opportunity.
So I'm a native-born Oregonian who spent most of my adult life there, and I worked in health policy in Oregon, and I did research in Oregon. And one thing I can tell you about Oregon is they love evidence-based health policy, and they are not afraid to do exciting things. So I think that Oregon is a phenomenal test case, and what I'm hoping is that people who are delivering care in Oregon will come together with the university, with the state, to come up with a really clear data collection strategy so that researchers can take advantage of studying all of the innovations and potential experiments that can happen to teach the rest of us, particularly around the different types of professionals that can do this work, the different types of settings this work can be done in, the different types of conditions that people will use psilocybin for. I think it's super exciting, but I definitely think that some real significant groundwork needs to be done in order to prepare people to capitalize on the information and take meaning from it.
Great. So we're going to move to question and answers. Thank you for those incredible discussions. I think we are learning so much about the research today. We're happy to take 10 or 15 minutes of questions, I assume. Oh, perfect.
Okay, I want to remind you guys to upvote or downvote the questions, which I don't have. I'm going to ask mine, but if anybody wants to reboot this iPad, I can ask your questions. The mic's working now. David, you mentioned a bunch of studies when you first started speaking, and I was familiar with all of them until you got to Baylor and University of Texas, and then I had a question mark. Can you please expand on those?
Yeah, great. The reality is a lot of really exciting research is happening in Texas and frankly around the Americas, actually not just in the U.S., around veterans work. And if you know Dr. Averill, there's a bill passed in Texas last year which the state of Texas beat everybody to fund a psychedelic study. And I think it's really important to recognize that this is with 5-MeO-DMT and other compounds and starting to look at what is possible. Because if you aren't aware, we have thousands of special operators, Navy SEALs, Rangers, Green Berets, et cetera, that can't get access to this work, have a history of TBI or PTSD, et cetera, and they are going to Mexico or Costa Rica or Peru to get these services. And Texas actually said, hey, look, let's see if we can capture some of that. So Dr. Averill is going to do some work out of Baylor, and then Greg Fonzo out of the University of Texas is doing some interesting conversations, not just with veterans, but their spouses, as well as Gold Star families. And so I think we're starting to see some really interesting applications that are both really critical populations, and actually leads into a different conversation, which is, veterans work, and the VA is really looking at this methodically right now, and there's a number of research studies happening at, with Dr. Yehuda here in the Bronx VA. I think Christopher's work on methamphetamine use disorder is really interesting to follow. He's also about to study the first group veterans study, which we've seen anecdotally a lot of examples of where this works. And then we're seeing lots of conversations at Stanford and the West LA VA, or the Palo Alto VA and the West LA VA in San Diego and in Georgia, really trying to keep track of where there's possibility to apply this within the VA system. And Heidi didn't get to this, but from an incentivized population standpoint, our healthcare system is typically not incentivized to think about us over the long term. The two exceptions are really Medicare, did I get that right? And the VA. Because they look at these populations long term. And so I think we'll see a lot of fascinating research. They're going to take their time because they are methodical, but coming out of the VA. And Texas was actually a big start in that, and the VA has really picked it up as well.
I know one of the things Dr. Yehuda is doing at the VA is comparing 2 sessions versus 3 sessions with MDMA-assisted therapy, and I think that will be helpful. In terms of how economics play into this, it seems pretty clear to a lot of us that group therapy and group work is going to be a way to really decrease costs. So I'm very interested in Christopher's work as well. And one more for you, David, is just if you could please mention the Brain Futures website, and also your reports, your publications are really helpful and useful. And I don't know if you fully...
If I can cheat a little bit, there's a QR code that I'll put up if they put the slides on, which goes to our website. The first one is about the clinical research. It's 170 pages, don't be scared. We broke it down to 20 pages by compound. So if you've got one you're most curious about, get started there. The second one is about clinical access and how we can actually get there. We've done a partnership with APA to work around what professional practice guidelines can look like in this space. We have a third paper that's going to drop next week where we talked to luminaries in this space, the Bill Richards of the world, the Mary Casamanos, the Tony Bosses, underground leaders about what their history is, and we've looked at the elements of what makes this work. But what I will say is that you're going to see this paper come out next week. You'll learn a lot about how to do this if you're curious or if you're involved in circles in either a legal or an underground context. But we also have noticed as we were doing that paper that's an incredibly expensive model. And so group and innovation, I really want to encourage people to look at our papers and think about how do we actually make this more innovative, more accessible, but without losing the focus on safety.
Don't forget to upvote or downvote your questions. We've got one for Dr. Allen. Curious to hear your thoughts about the role of social work in the psychedelic field, or what the social work perspective can bring to the field.
I feel like there's a plant in the room. Is Oh, okay. Well, social work is one of the only professions that I'm aware of that has a mandate in our code of ethics that we have to right societal wrongs. And I think that is an incredibly important perspective to bring to this. We're a boots-on-the-ground profession. We are in every single institution that health is produced in America. We bridge the medical and the social environments. And I think that we are also way cheaper than psychiatrists. We like to take more money if you want to give us more money, but we are less expensive. And we are the #1 provider of mental health services in the United States. So to not have us at the table is really problematic. We're also a very diverse workforce, particularly if you compare us to psychiatry. So there's a lot of reasons for social work to be at the table. At Columbia University, we are starting a social work therapy training program for social workers and I'm leading this. So my goal is to have people graduate ready to do this work with supervision so that they don't have to go and take a $10,000 to $15,000 training program after they just come out of school with a bunch of debt making $60,000 a year. We are partnering with nurses, which is another important profession to have at the table. And we have 2 institutions working on this, Columbia and Penn. And we're going to have both schools of social work and both schools of nurses doing this, hopefully within the next couple of years. And then we're going to share our curriculums without charge to any school of social work and any school of nursing in the country who want to take it, modify it, and adopt it to their student population. We have to get these disciplines out there and ready to do do this work, or we will not have access.
Another question for you, Dr. Allen, which is, what does the real-world research show for SSRIs for depression?
It shows that they are modestly effective, and they come with a lot of side effects. I think there's a lot of reasons to believe that psychedelics have a leg up. One, I've never heard anybody say that an SSRI experience blew their mind. That's not usually how we talk about therapy, like, oh my God, I just had the best. So it's a model, psychedelic therapy is a model based in love, and SSRIs are not. And I think this is tremendously important. Particularly right now, I have a kid who's suffering from depression, and we're trying med after med after med after med, is that you can get treatment and feel better that day. That is profound. That is so remarkable, and we need to talk about that more, because a lot of harm happens to people's life as they live month after month, year after year with depression that is not effectively treated. So I think if psychedelics perform as well as SSRIs, we still have a lot of reason to want to bring them into mainstream medicine and give them priority. What other treatment could you do in an inpatient psychiatric hospitalization that in the time that they're in the hospital, that they could come out feeling better? Right, it's like incredible. Like, we need to be talking about this, because I think comparing them without going into those elements isn't quite fair.
Okay, we have one more highly upvoted question for either of you, whoever's comfortable with it. And if you're not, say pass, because I think the next group could probably handle this question. The FDA has required a rather medicalized REMS program for esketamine. How worried are you about REMS for other compounds and medicalizing these treatments?
I really want to punt on that one.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that.
I also have a question about this issue of placebo and blinding, and one of the things that I've been saying for years, but no one's listening to me. I feel like if we could, maybe this is more of a comment than a question, if we could dilate everyone's pupils, I think we would have a fighting chance on placebo, because at least the person treating wouldn't immediately know what's going on. So there are drops, there are dramatic drops. At least that way, everybody undergoing the clinical research would look the same. Just an idea.
I think that's genius.
Yeah, I love that idea. But I would just say to that, the reality is we've talked about all this blinding and expectancy effects. The one thing that's really unique for everyone to understand here is we don't have a precedent for therapy tied to a drug and how to push that all the way through. And I think we just have to understand this is actually a new frontier. Take all the stigma, all the history. We're trying to do something that really hasn't been done in medicine before. And the one thing I want to say about the 200 studies that we had in our paper that I'm sure you're all going to read all throughout the day today is there is so much evidence that this works with therapy. This is not about the researching of the drug itself. It's drug plus therapy, and what does that look like? And we just have to make sure we don't separate that out, and also, not fail to lose the complexity of this. And we have examples in surgery, in particular, of where you can't placebo a surgery. You can't placebo because of moral effects, a number of other areas of this work. And I think it's really important for us to recognize that with some creativity, there's probably some possibility to move this forward.
I'd like to thank you both for a great opening presentation.